As we saw in our passage of Scripture this morning, the Bible is pretty clear on what the Christian attitude towards adultery is. Don't do it, right? This is not a difficult concept to grasp. We all know that adultery is wrong, and this isn't even a uniquely Christian idea. Just about everyone, everywhere in the world understands that adultery is wrong and it's destructive, and yet it still happens a lot. Statistically, about 20% of men and about 15% of married women have admitted to having an affair at some point in their marriage. Now, as I was looking into the data on infidelity to prepare for this message, I found some things that surprised me. For example, did you know that until the age of 30, women are more likely to have an affair than men, right? Until the age of 30. Now, I don't know why, but that surprised me, okay? But over the age of 30, men are the ones who are more likely to have an affair. In fact, with each decade of life a man enters, the more likely he is to have an affair. So a man in his 40s is more likely to cheat than a man in his 30s. A man in his 50s is more likely to cheat than a man in his 40s. And this is the statistic that really blew my mind. Okay, are you ready for this? Did you know that the segment of the population that is more likely to cheat than any other segment of the population is a man in his 70s? Men in their 70s are more likely to have an affair than any other segment of the population. I'm telling you, that blew my mind, okay? Now, if these statistics are discouraging to you, right, I want to encourage you. Remember, even as disheartening as some of these statistics can be, it's important to remember that most people don't cheat. Most men don't cheat. Most women don't cheat. Most people don't cheat. So if you're getting discouraged by the statistics, let's not get discouraged by that. So today's message is not actually about adultery. Today's message is about the thing that leads to adultery, which is lust. Right? But the reason that I bring up these statistics is because I think we can all agree that there is a connection between lust and adultery. But the second reason I bring up these statistics is because they demonstrate some of the common mistakes that we make when we talk about lust. For example, in the church, whenever we think about the segment of the population that really needs to hear a message about lust, what group do we typically think of? We think of young men, right? We think of young men. But the data tells us that this is probably a discussion we need to be having with old men as well, right? Now, even though older men struggle with lust, apparently, just as much as young men do, I suppose it does make a certain kind of sense to focus on young people when it comes to having conversations about lust, because especially if you're dealing with teenagers, these are newer feelings for them. You know, this is something they're still trying to navigate. Young people need to learn to distinguish between healthy sexual attraction on the one hand and lust on the other hand, right? They're just starting to figure this stuff out. But if that's the case, if we're going to say, okay, it's good to have these conversations with young people, why do we focus more on having these conversations with young men when the data tells us it is just as important to have these conversations with young women? And not only that, when we do have these conversations with young women, the conversation oftentimes isn't even about them. It's about the boy's lust. Right? Instead of having a conversation with young women about lust, the conversation becomes about how they need to dress modestly so that the boys won't lust after them. Even though we all know that if every woman on the planet dressed with perfect modesty, boys are still going to lust, right? Now, that is not to say that conversations about modesty are not important. Conversations about modesty are important. Modesty is important for Christians. But the conversation about modesty needs to be its own conversation. Because modesty is not as closely related to lust as we think it is. And because this is such a common misconception, I think it's important for us to take just a minute and look to see what the Bible has to say about modesty. 1 Timothy 2:9 says that women should dress themselves modestly and decently in suitable clothing, not with their hair braided or with gold pearls or expensive clothes, but with good works as is proper for women who profess reverence for God. Notice that the focus in this passage is not on the amount of clothes that people are wearing, but rather the focus is on the expense of the clothing that people are wearing. In this passage, modesty is not about putting your body on display, though putting your body on display is certainly one way of being immodest. But the passage is about putting your wealth on display. When you look at what the Bible has to say about modesty, it's not so much about protecting other people from lust as it is about protecting yourself from pride. Okay? So let me give you an example of what I mean here. There's a young woman at Truett Seminary, my alma mater, named Leah. Now, off the top of my head, I don't remember Leah's last name, but her Twitter handle is Leah B. Sassy. See? So Leah has gained quite a Twitter following in recent years because along with being sassy, she is also smart and funny, and she's got a strong theological mind. And another thing that Leah has become known for is her modesty. It is not something that she has tried to become known for, because I suppose once you try to become known for your modesty, you're no longer being modest, right? So this is not something she has tried to become known for, but people have noticed that she always dresses modestly, and they ask her about it. Anytime you see a photo of her, she's wearing an ankle-length skirt or long pants. She always wears shirts that cover her shoulders. Not a lot of makeup, not a lot of jewelry. By whatever definition of modesty that you may have, she dresses modestly. Now, one of the things that has happened as Leah has gained a larger following on Twitter is that sometimes she receives inappropriate direct messages from men telling her, folks, I kid you not, telling her that it is her modesty that turns them on. Folks, she has even received a message like this from a pastor of a church. Now, as you can imagine, this has been frustrating for Leah because that is exactly the opposite of what she's going for. But this situation has brought Leah to a really important observation about modesty. Leah says that her motivation for modesty isn't so much about keeping men from lusting, because her experience tells her that that may not work, right? Rather, her motivation for modesty is that she wants other people to be able to see Christ in her. She doesn't want to draw attention to herself. She wants to draw attention to Jesus. And she doesn't want her clothing choices to distract from him. And folks, I cannot think of a better motivation for modesty than that. Because when the choices that we make about the clothes that we wear, the cars that we drive, the houses that we live in, are about putting ourselves on display. Whether it is about our bodies or our wealth or our status, whatever it is that we are trying to put on display for others, that is immodest. It's all about drawing attention to ourselves, and that distracts from Christ in us. And the thing is, men are just as guilty of this as women. And so when we single out young ladies for conversations about modesty, and we tell them that it is all about helping the boys not to lust, the unintended message that we are sending is that when boys lust, it's the girl's fault. That may not be the message we are trying to send, but that is the message that's getting across. And we are heaping unwarranted shame on our young ladies. And if you have a hard time seeing that, right? Seeing this idea that that's the message that's getting through to young ladies, that's the message that's getting through even to young men, I want you to think about this. When was the last time that you heard a woman blame her lust on a man? When was the last time you heard a woman blame her lust on a man? Now, we all play the blame game. Both women and men play the blame game whenever we do something wrong, but I'm talking specifically about lust here. When was the last time you heard a woman blame her lust on a man? I know I've never heard a woman blame their lust on me, right? But truthfully, I don't know that I've ever heard a woman blame her lust on a man ever. But I hear men blame their lust on women all the time. I hear men blame their lust on women all the time, and we've been doing it since Adam in the garden. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. Part of it's just because our gut reaction to the shame of sin, for both men and women, is to try and put the blame on someone else. Okay? But I think specifically with the sin of lust, there is something else at work here, and I think it is the messages that we are sending to our young women and our young men when it comes to what lust is, what modesty is. I think it comes down to a misunderstanding of what the real definition of what lust is. So we're going to spend some time now talking about what lust is, why it's so destructive, and then we're going to close with how we can overcome it. That is some loud water drinking. Okay. So first of all, what is lust? Well, lust is typically defined as unbridled sexual desire. Unbridled sexual desire. Not just sexual desire, but unbridled sexual desire. It's important to remember that sexual desire is not in and of itself a sin. In fact, sexual desire is a good thing. It's how we end up with a full preschool department over there, right? Sexual desire is something that God has created within us so that we would be fruitful and multiply. And when we cultivate sexual desire in the way that God intended, within the context of love and marriage, it can be an important part of human flourishing. And so sexual desire in and of itself is not sinful. Unbridled sexual desire is sinful. And unbridled sexual desire means that this is a desire that you have lost control of. And the way that you lose control of what started out as something healthy and natural is when you indulge that desire in ways that are outside of God's design. So let's talk a little bit about God's design. There are two primary purposes for which God has designed sexual desire. The first is so that we would be fruitful and multiply. We've already mentioned that. That's pretty obvious. And the second is to strengthen the bond of love between a husband and a wife. Now, I'm going to tell you all a little secret. Do you like secrets? Okay, well, I'm going to tell you a little secret. In addition to procreation and strengthening the bond of marriage, it is also true that sex is awesome. It is. It's great. That's the way God has designed it, right? God made sex to be pleasurable. It's supposed to be pleasurable, but here's the thing. God created sex to be pleasurable in order to serve the end of procreation. God created sex to be pleasurable in order to serve the end of strengthening the bond of marriage. And so when we instead indulge our sexual urges for the sake of pleasure and pleasure alone, that's when we've crossed over into the lust territory. When we remove procreation, love, and marriage from the equation, and we indulge our desires for the sake of pleasure alone, that once healthy desire no longer contributes to our flourishing. It instead contributes to our destruction. The reason we include lust as one of the 7 deadly sins is because when you lose control of sexual desire, when you no longer control it, but it controls you, that's destructive not only for you, but for your family. And it's even destructive for the person who is the object of your lust. Now, did you know that the dopamine rush that happens during sexual activity is similar to the dopamine rush that you get from heroin? That is something else, right? That's pretty intense. Now, and so the reason that lust can be so destructive is because it's got this highly addictive quality to it. And just like any other addiction, it starts out as a desire that you may just indulge every once in a while, but over time, the more you indulge, the more it starts to gain control over you. And just like any other addiction, the more you indulge, the more you need in order to be satisfied. And before you know it, you may have graduated from lust to full-on adultery. When Jesus says in Matthew 5 that if you look at a woman with lust, then you've already committed adultery with her in your heart, I don't think he was using hyperbole there. Jesus used hyperbole a lot. I'm not positive he was using it here. And here's why. Because I think that he literally meant that if you look at a person with lust, the only thing standing between you and adultery is time and opportunity. Because remember, the more you indulge it, the more you need. And so time, that's standing between you and adultery, and opportunity is that other person attracted to you as well. Right? I think Jesus is being real here when he says that if you look at lust, if you look at a woman with lust, then you've already committed adultery with her in your heart. And so we see how this is destructive for you and eventually for your family, but it's also destructive for the person who is the object of your lust. And the reason it's destructive for them is because when you separate desire from procreation, love, and marriage, the only thing that you're left with is the desire, right? And you make pleasure the most important thing. And so when you do that, the person who is the object of your lust becomes just that, an object that you have used for your pleasure. And in that act of lust, you have failed to acknowledge their humanity. You have failed to acknowledge their dignity as image bearers of the living God. And you have failed to acknowledge their personhood. And when we do that, when we fail to acknowledge a person's humanity, there is no end to the ways in which we will be willing to hurt them as long as it suits our own pleasure. Is it starting to make sense why we call this a deadly sin? Right? A deadly sin. Okay. Now, I realize that parts of this message have been a little heavy. Okay? So I want to close this out today with some encouragement. Remember, even though just about everyone has struggled with lust at some point in their life, and even though lust is a difficult sin to overcome, remember, it is still true that most people don't cheat. Most men don't cheat. Most women don't cheat. And did you know that if you and your family are active in a local church, then the odds are even better for you? This is really interesting. In 2018, the University of Chicago, a secular institution, conducted a nationwide survey in which they found that people who attend religious services at least semi-regularly are less likely to cheat on their spouses. In fact, the data showed that there was no other factor which contributed more to low rates of infidelity than church attendance. And so what they found was that the more that your family attended church, the lower the rates of infidelity were for those families. Now, this particular study didn't get into the specifics of why church attendance had that kind of impact. The researchers assume it has something to do with how church is a place where The importance of family and marriage stability are encouraged, and I'm sure that plays a big part, but I think that there is also something else at work here. A friend of mine who's dealt with addiction before told me that, he once told me that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And when you consider that lust, like all of the 7 deadly sins, functions a lot like addiction, and when you consider that church is all about connection, you begin to understand how being active in a local church will help you to overcome not only lust, but whatever kind of sin that you might be stuck in. Because overcoming lust, just like any sin, begins with our connection to God, right? It begins with our connection to God and our connection to other people. And the stronger that these connections are, the more likely we are to overcome. And so if you're struggling with lust or any sin, my first question to you is, are you connected to God? More specifically, are you connected to God through prayer? Prayer is an essential part of overcoming sin. And I'm not just talking about praying that God will deliver you from your sin, though that is huge, right? That's a big part of it. I'm talking about cultivating a life of prayer. The daily practice of submitting your will to God's will, listening to God's Spirit, praying the Psalms, praying for the people you love, praying for your enemies. I'm talking about cultivating a robust life of prayer, because when prayer becomes a daily discipline, what happens is that you begin to turn your will over to God. And you begin to rely on God's Spirit. And in that process, your own will begins to heal. And rather than fighting against God's will, your will becomes more aligned with His will. Right? And so the struggle against sin becomes more manageable. And so if you struggle with lust, my first question to you is, are you connecting with God through prayer? And my second question is, are you connecting with other people through the love of Christ? If you're married, are you cultivating the love that you share with your spouse? Are you tending to it, nourishing it, and helping it grow? Because a marriage in which your mutual love is not being cultivated can become a place where lust starts to creep in. Now, whether you are married or single, are you cultivating Christ-like love in your friendships? Strong connections with friends are really important, because with good friends, you've got a support system. And not only that, but in the absence of strong friendships, loneliness becomes fertile soil for lust. And so are you building strong connections in your friendships? And finally, is your attitude towards people in general an attitude of Christian love? Because if your attitude towards all of the people you encounter is an attitude of Christian love, then there won't be any room in your life for lust. Because remember, when you lust after someone, you have ignored their humanity and you have made them an object. And that is not something that love can do. And so is your attitude toward people in general an attitude of Christian love? At Lazy Brook Baptist Church, we want to be a place where you can find connection with God, where you can build strong connections with other people. And we want to be a place where you can come alongside of us as we learn what it means to love people with the love of Jesus. We want to be a place where you can find forgiveness and have the opportunity to overcome sin. If you don't belong to a church, we'd love to talk to you about that and help you understand what that looks like. And if that is something that interests you, you can come and talk to me after this worship service, or you can text decisions to the number on the screen right behind me, and Pastor Zach will get back in touch with you pretty soon. And so if that's something that interests you, I really encourage you to reach out to us.